in our Is this yours?
That's mine.
And your talk is on here?
No, not on this one, on this one.
Okay, and this is the HDMI right here.
Okay, thank you.
No, it's all right.
Mike, did you take that mic?
Thank you. There it is. Mhm.
Okay, our final speaker for today is Eva Jablonka, who will be, I don't remember exactly the title.
Well, it's about
It's not on.
animal consciousness. It's about an evolutionary approach to consciousness. So thank you very much for surviving that long, and thank you for staying. I know it's very difficult, and I hope, yeah, well, the forces of nature are against me. There's some marshmallows there. Shall I put my PowerPoint? PowerPoint? I have. I have a stick. Zal. Okay, så vad kunde. It did work before. It was tested, but. Yeah, but you know, it's there are many things on this thing.
PowerPoint? I have PowerPoint. Okay. Well, let's put it on this computer though. Is this one of these no name? That must be you. Maybe it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's go down, down. It's the last one. Should be, well, I don't know where it is. Bloody hell. Where is it? This one. Ah, yes, this is.
This PDF?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So what do we want me to open it with?
Yes, just open it.
It's PDF?
As PDF, yes, sure.
Oh,
Yeah, that's it. That's it. But it has to be connected there.
Open.
But there's nothing.
No. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
It hit play.
Is it full
Is it
screen?
play?
No.
Hit play, because then it'll show up.
There is no play. No, we just.
Oh, it's in preview.
What program do you want to
Put in full screen.
I don't care. I'm in full screen.
Try put in full screen.
Yeah.
No?
No. Oh,
Okay.
something happened. Full screen.
You.
That's it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I will not make many introductions. I just want to say that I'm going to talk about a theory of consciousness that is that takes an evolutionary approach and tries to figure out how we can think about consciousness from an evolutionary point of view. The work that I'm talking about has been done with Simona Ginsburg. This picture and other original pictures are by Anna Zhiligovsky. I want to thank very much my wonderful student Zohar Bronfman, unfortunately no more my student, and Jonathan Birch, with whom I'm working now, and where we're trying to put together this thing. This tree is a calligram made up of the words of this Japanese poem. This Japanese poem says, "What is the mind? It is the sound of the breeze that passes through the pines in the Indian ink picture." This is a representation of a representation, and this is a representation of all these representations. And I'm not going to talk about this high-level kind of representation. I'm going to talk about the very origins of consciousness and how we can think about them. So, where is it? Okay, so here we are. Me and Monsi and Anna, who did the pictures. And I want to make clear what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to assume that the conscious experiencing being, which has a subjective point of view about the world and about its own body, that where there is something like to be this kind of being. And in order to reach this level of being, this mode of being, there must have been an evolutionary process that led to it. Not everything on the planet, volcanoes, stars, and things like that, are not conscious. We are. And we think that other animals are too. Now, what we want to do, our kind of evolutionary approach, is to identify the transition to a conscious mode of being, starting with something that there will be a general agreement about that they are not conscious, and then there will be a general agreement about the simplest possible conscious being. Now, it's very, very difficult to know what is the simplest possible conscious being. This is the trick, and this is the problem. So, and the reason that we want to find this original, this first step in consciousness, the simplest mode of consciousness that we can imagine, is that if we're thinking about creatures like us or creatures like other very complicated animals, there was a very long evolution of the mind, which already associates and disassociates many things and may mask the very, very basic principles that are the markers of consciousness. That is why we want to look at the transition to consciousness. So what we suggest, so at the heart of our approach is a concept of what we call an evolutionary marker, evolutionary transition marker. I will call it transition marker for shortness. A transition marker is a property, a capacity of a system, such that when we find evidence of it, we have evidence that the major evolutionary transition in which we are interested, in this case the transition to consciousness, has gone to completion. Okay, and I will give you an example of that. I will explain it via an analogy. The analogy is the origin of life. It's very, very difficult to understand what life is. It's very difficult to define it. And nobody actually agrees about precisely what is necessary and what is not necessary, but there is, on the whole, a very wide consensus about basic properties of living entities. And the consensus includes maintenance of a boundary, some kind of individuation, metabolism, stability, information storage, regulation of the internal milieu, growth, reproduction, and death, irreversible disintegration. If we go to another planet and we find entities with these properties, we will say, well, they're probably alive. That's all. It's not a logical deduction. It's something that most of us would agree about. Now, people have been thinking about the origin of life for a very long time, and there have been active research for over 100 years. And one of the people who have thought deeply about it is a Hungarian theoretical chemist called Tibor Ganti. And he and after him, Maynard Smith and Ernst Satmary, proposed an evolutionary transition marker to life. They didn't call it transition marker, but this is what they meant. And what they suggested was that the evolutionary transition marker to life is what they called unlimited heredity. Unlimited heredity is the capacity to form lineages of open-ended length, varying in open-ended ways from the initial system. So you can have a lot of variations. The DNA-based heredity system of all life on Earth is the only known biochemical example of an unlimited heredity system. Now, I want it to be very clear. The unlimited heredity system is not life. We're thinking about DNA, which is, for example, such a polymer with unlimited hereditary variation. DNA is not alive. The cell is alive. But it is a very good marker of life, because if you want to reverse engineer, if we went to a planet, to another planet, and we wanted to reverse engineer, and we found the frozen molecules, long molecules such as DNA, and we didn't know anything about it. But we know that such molecules couldn't form spontaneously. And then we think, well, what kind of system is necessary for making such molecules? What is necessary? And when we reverse engineer that, we come to something like a protocell, because it needs to have a boundary, and it needs to have some kind of metabolism inside, and it needs to have all these properties that Ganti was talking about. That is why it is a good transition marker. So if we're thinking about it in terms of kind of general diagram, we have all these properties. Unlimited heredity, for unlimited heredity to exist in the world, we need all these properties to be in place. And when these properties are in place, we say, well, this is a living system. So the unlimited heredity is a marker, marks the presence of a living system. So we thought, well, that's a very good way of thinking about a very difficult problem. Let's use this in order to think about consciousness, which also cannot be precisely defined. We've heard here already, not exactly definitions, but many different characterizations of it. But nevertheless, we think there is a consensus. So generally speaking, we have a list of characteristics. A transition marker requires that a certain list of characteristics is in place. When this list of characteristics is in place, we infer a certain mode of being, living, or consciousness, which is our interest. And therefore, we say the transition marker marks the presence of this mode of being. So about what do we have a consensus? Now, Monsi and I spent a long year trying to go through many different types of literature, including philosophy, including different types of philosophy, phenomenology, and other things. Also cognitive science, of course, and neuroscience. And I think that if we find a creature somewhere on another planet again that has this list of properties, we would say, well, this creature is likely to be conscious. That's all. So global accessibility and broadcasts of all kinds of perceptual and motor stimuli, some kind of unification of this, whether or not we're certain about something or not, we have a unified experience of this certain or uncertain thing. Selective attention and exclusion. There must be a huge amount of exclusion mechanisms if we're really able to form many different unified percepts and actions. There must be also integration through time, the kind of depth, the kind of temporal depth that Merleau-Ponty and others have been talking about. There must be a flexible evaluative system. Some we know about emotions, which are such evaluative systems, for example. But we must assume, even if we don't talk in mentalistic terms, we must assume that the system that gives valence is very flexible. The creatures must have agency. It has to be embodied in a certain way. Probably not every embodiment would work. And there must be some kind of registration of self and other. The other can be the world. Now, if we found something like that, some of us may not agree that this is a conscious being. For example, we don't have theory of mind here. as a necessary condition. But we're speaking about very elementary types of consciousness, non-human consciousness. If we found something like that, we would say, not bad. Probably we have to be careful with this creature. It probably feels pain and joy and such things. Now, okay, so we thought what could be a good marker for this. And we came to the conclusion after a year of working on this that the best candidate that we came to was something that we called, inspired by Maynard Smith and Satmary, unlimited associative learning. Now, unlimited, when I'm saying unlimited, I'm not meaning it, of course, in the mathematical sense. Everything is constrained in the world, but it means that the number of variation is so big that it is much greater than the individual or even the lineage is ever likely to experience during its lifetime. That's all I mean. So what do we need? We thought that a certain type of learning would be the key, and this type of learning is what we called unlimited associative learning, UAL for short. In order, we demand from the system several things. First of all, that it will be able to distinguish and discriminate between complex stimuli, between complex percepts that are made up of different ingredients that can be organized in different ways. So it can distinguish between different configuration of the same stimuli. And the same with action. And this different aspects of the stimuli can be in one particular modality, or they can be in different modalities. A second thing is that the stimulus, this novel stimuli that are learned and are predictive, are novel to the organism. And they themselves are not inherently good or bad for it. They don't have an a priori valence. They are predictive of some kind of valence. And we also need second order conditioning. That is, we build, once you learn that a certain configuration predicts something that is good or bad or whatever, then you can build on this and you can use what you have learned as a basis for further learning. There is an implication here, which we didn't write down, that one of the things that such a system will give you, and some of the things that such a system, that a UAL system requires, is what you talked about, the escape from immediacy. So in behaviorist terms, it is the animal can learn by trace conditioning. That is, you give him the stimulus, you wait, for example, 1 or 2 seconds, and then you only give it the prize or the punishment, and nevertheless it is able to learn. Okay. Now, it's very interesting because UAL, of course, expands the ontogenetic adjustments that an animal is able to make by orders of magnitude, because it is able to learn so much about the world and about itself and about the relationship between itself and the world. And it is also recursive because we have this possibility for second order learning. So it's generative because you can combine everything, almost everything. Of course, there are constraints, but many things with many things. Okay. And this is just an example of unlimited associative learning. It's spatial learning, where this mouse has to have a multimodal integration of stimuli, many of which are new. It has to make a lot of small decisions as it is learning about its environment and as it is implementing what it has learned about its environment. And it has to have very flexible value systems, because something that it thought was good or was good for the short term then turned out to be not good in a particular context. So it has to change the valence of this particular percept. It's just one example out of many. Now, in order for this to happen, the functional architecture that is necessary for such a system to exist, such a learning system to exist, there must be mechanisms that integrate various underlying features to form a compound. And this requires that, I will not go into why, that there is a lot of recurrent multi-stage hierarchical kind of processing. There must be interactions that generate some kind of self-model. There must be some kind of model of the world, some kind of mapping of the world into the animal, some kind of self-model, some kind of model of interaction between, some kind of model of prospective action. All this, when I'm talking about models, I'm just talking about mappings, neural mappings, and very, very dynamic and very ever-changing neural mappings. There must be exclusion of irrelevant signals and focusing mechanisms. There must be dedicated memory systems for compounds, like the hippocampus, like mushroom bodies in some insects. And there must be flexible evaluation system that must be able to assign valence to any compound input. Of course, it doesn't have to be anatomically just one system. It can be distributed. All the systems can be distributed and are. And it is possible to build a toy model of this, and I will not bore you with the toy model because it needs half an hour. Now, when we're trying to translate the list of requirements that we said, that the list of consensus requirements, and we're trying to see, does UAL actually require this? The answer is yes, it does. And indeed, there must be global accessibility and broadcast between percept, action patterns, and so on, leading to memories, comparisons, generalizations, whatever. There must be some kind of integration of sensory stimuli into patterns through some kind of recurrent network. Must be selective attention, selective exclusion. There must be some intentionality, and here I'm talking very, very simply about mapping. Something is like something else. The as, what Ullmann famously said, I see this thing as a cat. I see this thing as a computer, the as function. And there must be integration through time, working memory, embodiment, certain embodiment, as I said, registration of self and other. And we can go into each of these things and show why UAL requires actually each of these features. So that's why we think it's actually a good evolutionary marker. So if we go back to this list, we say, well, unlimited associative learning requires that these things are in place. This thing in turn suffice for something that there will be a general, although not universal agreement, is a experiencing system, and therefore unlimited associative learning marks the presence of a conscious mode of being. So that is so. If this is the case, we can answer a lot of questions that otherwise are very, very difficult. One of the difficult questions for biologists is, how is consciousness distributed in the world? Which animals are conscious? Which animals are not? As I said, UAL is not the same as consciousness. It's only a marker, right? But this is something that is tangible. We can study it. We can see which animals have UAL and which don't. How is this capacity distributed in the world? And when we do this, and we're looking now, I must tell you here that we have a problem because there are a lot of animal phyla. There are 36 of them altogether. There are a lot of animal phyla that have not been studied. We don't know anything about their learning abilities. Monty and I wrote many letters to all kinds of people who are working on phyla we first learned about when we were doing this work, who were so happy that somebody in the world was interested. But anyway, what we do have evidence for is that there are three groups, three groups in which we find this. One is the vertebrates, almost all of them. We can't say all of them because there are two very primitive vertebrates where learning has not been properly ever studied, the most primitive, so maybe they are not. The mollusks, and only only a particular group of cephalopods, the colloid cephalopods among the mollusks, which are the octopus, the squids, and the cuttlefish, and many arthropods, many insects, are able to learn in this way. So we infer that since they have the capacity of UAL, they probably have some kind of very minimal consciousness, something like that. Okay, further on, when we're looking at the brains of these animals, we find areas in the brains of these animals which are doing the job, which are integrating various underlying sensory features to form a compound configurations. There is hierarchical recurrent kind of mapping of the world and so on. There is an ability to distinguish between body-generated and word-generated stimuli, something that is very, very important, especially complex stimuli. There is a dedicated memory system that all these animals have, and there is an evaluation system that is very flexible. So they have these capacities, they have the brains that can do this kind of things. And this is something very interesting. This is a functional comparison of a mammalian brain and an insect brain, done by Strausfeld, who is one of the great insect brain anatomists doing functional anatomy. And what is amazing about it is the functional homology. The brains are completely different structurally. Nevertheless, when you are looking at the functional relationship in these brains, you see something very, very similar. This is what we expect. We cannot say the same exactly about the mollusks because we don't have enough information. But some of these analogies exist also in the coleoid mollusks, in the cephalopods. Okay, so now we can ask another question. Okay, when did creatures with this brain anatomies first appear on the planet? And we can answer. They appeared during the Cambrian, 542 million years ago. Can't give you the day, but more or less, right? And these are them. These three. Now, let me be sorry. The arthropoda and the vertebrates appear during the Cambrian. This group, the mollusk also appeared then, but the coleoid cephalopods, the only ones where we have evidence for this kind of learning and the brain structures that support it, appeared 250 million years later. So what we already can say is that consciousness, that UAL, and by implication consciousness, evolved either 3 times independently or twice, because it evolved independently in the mollusks, we are almost sure. Whether or not there is a common ancestor to the vertebrate and to the arthropod, there is a lot of discussion about it in the literature. We tend to believe that it is also parallel evolution, but we will not go into it. Now, we also argue, and this is independent from what I have said by now, that not only did associative learning and specifically unlimited associative learning appear in the Cambrian, it was also, the Cambrian, by the way, this particular period is the period when, in very, very short period of time, geologically speaking, something like 20 to 50 million years, all the animal forms, all the animal phyla, almost all the animal phyla, not all, almost all the animal phyla appeared. It is called, therefore, the Cambrian Explosion. And there are at least 30 different interpretations for the Cambrian explosion. We are giving another an additional factor that we think drove this great explosion, and we think that not only did UAL appear during this period, it also drove the Cambrian explosion because it opened up, it created all kinds of arm races between learning animals, their predators and their preys, that were driving very, very rapid rates of evolution. Okay. Now, one of the things that you may ask is, okay, what are the predictions of this? You told us a story. How can you test your theory? So, I can tell you this. I can first of all establish which animals can really do good UAL in all kinds of dimensions, right? So I'm looking at spatial learning, discrimination learning, trace conditioning, reverse learning, decision making when there are motivational trade-offs. And I'm establishing which animals can do it and which animals can't. And then I'm testing this, by the way, on animals, but also on humans. The same kind of experiments. And then I'm doing these experiments, testing discrimination learning, trace conditioning, reverse learning, motivational trade-offs under mask conditions in humans and in animals. And I expect to see, and I know that people have been looking at much simpler tasks when they were looking at when they were doing masking experiments. They were looking not at learning. Sometimes they did. There are several experiments that did look at it, but they were not looking, for example, at discrimination learning, and something that doesn't just pop up, but that requires a little bit of effort. And they didn't do, and trace conditioning, there are experiments of trace conditioning, and we know that trace conditioning cannot be learned unless the subject is conscious. Under mask conditions, it is not learned or learned at very, very low frequency. Okay, very low frequency. Reverse learning, I'm not aware that people did reverse learning experiments, but I guess they were done. And if they were done, I would predict that, again, reverse learning, when you are masking, is very, very difficult to learn. The same with complex motivational trade-offs. Not something, again, which is obvious and very, very salient, but something that requires a little bit of effort, and therefore requires exclusion, and therefore requires focusing, and all this kind of things. So what we're suggesting is that we do these experiments on humans in masked and unmasked conditions. We do the same experiments on animals. And I can tell you that some people are actually trying to do it, fortunately. I mean, until recently, nobody was thinking of doing masking experiments on bees. But I think that but there is somebody who is. So I'm very glad about that, because I think this is, now again, you can always argue, look, what you see in animals is just similar, parallel to what you see in humans. You don't know for sure that they're conscious. True, I cannot prove it, but all I can tell you is, look, if there are so many functional homologies, and there is also a good theory behind it, unless you have problems with the theory, then, well, it's not a bad bet, is it? So we also expect certain lesions. I don't have time, so I won't go into it, but we expect certain brain lesions in mammals, in insects, and in colloid cephalopods to have certain effects on learning, very specific effects on, they will have many effects because, of course, it is a distributed system, but they will have particularly strong effects on particular learning abilities that will again mirror those that we find in humans. Now, so I come to the conclusions. So we suggest that UAL is the transition marker of consciousness, and in fact we argue that the evolution of UAL, when UAL also didn't pop up from heaven, it evolved, and we argue that the evolution of UAL led to creatures that are conscious. Now, we are not saying that every creature is conscious in the same way. There are levels of consciousness. The consciousness can be more or less rich. But we're talking about something that would satisfy us, that something like subjective experiencing is happening. And there is a limitation to our theory. What our theory can tell you, if we find UAL, we can say, well, it is very highly likely that this animal is conscious. When we don't find it, we can't say anything. We are not sure. We will say probably not, but we can't be sure about that. And we think that when UAL evolved, then it was both necessary and sufficient for consciousness during the evolutionary period in which it appeared, within the certain, in the biological creatures in which it appeared, right? We're not giving you a general argument about consciousness in robots. And we think, but it is only a sufficient condition during development. So in evolution, it was both necessary and sufficient. Now, babies are, of course, conscious because they have the system. It is the system that is conscious, not the UAL, right? It's what we call the enabling system. And we think that UAL evolved in arthropods and vertebrates during the Cambrian and was one of the drivers of the Cambrian explosion. And there are predictions here too. We can test this assumption by looking at the coevolution of this form of learning with other systems, the other physiological systems, such as, for example, the immune system, but not only. Also, the evolution of sleep is very related to this, we think. And experiments can test the predictions that link UAL and conscious learning in humans and by inference in other animals. And about robots, robots, first of all, are at the moment our extended phenotype and wouldn't exist unless we existed. Unless a biological conscious creature has existed. But maybe there is some kind of different embodiment that would make it possible. I don't know if it will depend on UAL or not. I don't think it's necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this great talk. I'm going to take advantage of having the mic and ask the first question, if everyone will indulge me. Which is, I keep thinking about Rafi and Leon's discussions of sort of consciousness in a slice. Would you be willing to apply the same criteria to a brain region or a structure?
No.
But it has to be
I think for me, it is only creature consciousness. It is not, again, to quote my favorite philosopher, Aristotle, the eye does not see, the animal sees. The brain does not think, the animal thinks.
Thank you very much, Chava. You described at the beginning of your talk, you talked about consciousness, also at the end of your talk, consciousness as having a point of view, what it's like, etc., a notion that has some ethical implications, etc., and you gave a marker for the existence of this consciousness. By contrast, the previous speakers talked about not about a marker for the existence of consciousness, but about what is consciousness in the brain or something like that. For example, Mike talked about the decision to report. Leon described a bundle of some things that together make up the before and after and possibly the consciousness itself and so on. So we have here what seem to be different notions or definitions or something like that of consciousness. Now, definitions as such are not very interesting. Of course, there are stipulations. Nevertheless, I think it would be useful to avoid talking past each other, so to create some common ground here, so to make sure that we're talking about the same thing rather than about different phenomena. So I'm wondering about what your opinion is about the connection between the thing of which UAL is a marker and what the thing itself is, possibly given what previous speakers suggested.
Look, most of the talks here were about humans. All of the talks here were about humans or about rhesus monkeys, right? Or about monkeys. And we have very good reasons to, certainly we know that we are conscious. By analogy, we assume that monkeys too may be conscious, but there are disagreements about that. But we do know that we are. Now, if we know that we are, we can ask people, and they can report that we have an easy way of comparing a percept that was of which a person was aware, and the same percept when the person was not aware of it. We have this kind of, and then we can look at the brain and look at all these differences. And these differences tell us a great deal. When we were working on our very fat book, that's why we're writing now short papers, so that somebody will read them, is that so obviously we used everything that we could in a very kind of pragmatic way. Anything that could help us, anything that was gleaned from work on humans that we can apply to animals, we did. Now, however, we can't use everything because it's a very, very, very different brain organization. So what we are saying is this. If you take an animal, a very, very simple animal that does have UAL, and you reverse engineer from this capacity, you try to see what are the biological systems and processes and dynamics and everything. On the basis of all the knowledge that we have about neurobiology, you will come to an animal like, for example, maybe a fly, maybe a shrimp, maybe a very small fish, 3 centimeter long fish, with a little brain ticking away in its little head, and so on. So we expect that this is what you would find on the basis of the biology that we know. I can't tell you about biology that I don't know. I can tell you only about consciousness as we know it, within the framework of biology as we know it. So I think that you can reverse engineer in this way. This is a very big task. We didn't do it. The only thing that we did, and this also was preliminary, was build a little reverse engineer and build a little tiny little model, toy model of the UAL system. But this is only the very beginning. So this is, now we have to study also all these animals that have UAL. Now what I'm trying to say is, I know that, for example, there are a lot of people who disagree, who think that only humans are conscious. Or only creatures, like you said, that have a theory of mind are conscious. And it is very interesting. And I think that certain types of consciousness are possible only in creatures that have theory of mind and that interact and that can differentiate between self and other and have some kind of notion of the other. And I think that our type of consciousness, human consciousness, is super different from anything else in the living world. I think we do have a different type of consciousness. This is why it's so difficult to infer from humans to other animals, because we are truly different, because we have language, and because we have this way of reporting about the world and creating an objective world about which there is an agreement between different people that you were talking about. But this is a very, very special type of consciousness. I don't think that in order to feel pain and joy, or something like that, you need it. You do need it to have. I think that our language and our kind of consciousness also changed us, changed our consciousness, even our feelings. It's also engendered new feelings. For example, shame. Shame and the famous blush, which is the only expression of emotions, as Darwin told us, that is special to humans. We have new kind of feelings too. We have a new range of emotions. But the very basic emotions, the very simple emotions, I think are shared between us and other animals, and that there is, in spite of this discontinuity between us and other animals, there is also a continuity.
I would like also to thank you first for very thoughtful discussion. I would like to ask about the DNA term in the unlimited heredity approach, and if there is any parallel in this approach. What I mean is that you were talking about even if you don't see heredity, the behavioral heredity, you might find DNA and then suspect that this creature is a living one.
No. I can expect that this DNA was part of a living creature. This is what I expect.
Okay, so I would like to ask about the same thing, which is, again, not dependent on behavioral in the unlimited associative learning. Do we have something like this, or is there any
We didn't find anything like this. We looked at molecules, we looked at brain structures, we looked at all kinds of things. We didn't find it. The only level at which we could find something was behavior, and the particular type of behavior. I mean, we really spent a lot of time and effort trying to look at all kinds of stuff.
I think you mentioned something in the previous answer, but I try to make sure, like, what is your opinion? Why do you think there's no such thing as some kind of creature that is able to feel pain when being hurt, but without being able to do this unlimited associative learning?
I didn't say this. I said that evolutionarily there was not such creature. I don't say a baby can't learn by UAL. Yeah, I mean it cannot.
Actually, that's my question.
Yes,
I think
because
evolutionally
it,
there's
an
no such
ontogeny doesn't replicate phylogeny, and phylogeny doesn't replicate ontogeny. I mean, if you, I'll give you an example, okay? The example is, think about a red blood cell, okay? Erythrocyte. It doesn't, it loses its nucleus, and yet it lives for 120 days. It lives, it's a living thing, in spite of the fact that it doesn't have a nucleus. Why is it the case? But you couldn't think about an erythrocyte without thinking about something that did have DNA, and this is a particular adaptation or particular developmental stage where it doesn't require it, right? It is true that it cannot be that this cannot be sustained for a long time. So to refine what we say, not only is limited heredity, for example, long DNA molecules and such things, a good marker of life, it is a marker, evolutionary marker. It's not a marker of life as it is now. It's an evolutionary marker during the evolution, during the origin of the evolution process that led to this. It is a good marker for sustainable life. It is possible that something very, very fragile has been formed and disappeared because it couldn't be sustained. If you don't have unlimited heredity, you can't have open-ended evolution. And the environment will kill you sooner or later, sooner rather than later. The same is true also with we believe with UAL. If in a lineage UAL is lost, for whatever reason, in a lineage, after I don't know how many generations, consciousness will be lost too, we expect. This is a prediction.
So first of all, thank you. It was really stimulating and interesting. You said several times that if we find UAL in an animal, it means that it's likely that it has consciousness.
Yes.
Why do you use the term likely? Because let's say with life, like there are certain characteristics, and then by definition, it is alive.
No, it's not. You see, because when you are looking at the very, very beginnings of a process, there is a lot of gray area there. You are never sure. A lot depends on your theory at this point. This is the problem. This is one of the problems when you're working on a transition and you are trying to find the transition point. You never find a point where suddenly it pops up. You find something like a gray area. Is it conscious? Isn't it conscious? I'm not sure. But at a certain point, you would say, well, this is alive. This is a cell, and this is alive. When you are looking at, if you're looking at all kinds of theories of life, for example, people have all kinds of lovely models of systems about which you cannot be sure. And I think that when you're thinking about the evolutionary transition, all we can say is, look, it is highly likely, especially if we have a lot of independent evidence for it. I mean, we have the behavior, we have all the neural correlates of this behavior, we have the brain structures that can support it, we see that it is truly open-ended. And even here, I mean, again, I want to stress, I'm not saying that the consciousness of a mouse and the consciousness of a human and the consciousness of a bee are the same. They are not. Obviously, they are not. And they are, and as I said, the consciousness of humans is very, very different from anything else that we know on the planet. And the consciousness of a bee is likely to be very, very different from the consciousness of a mouse or a rat. Certainly a rat.
Could you quantize that? Like,
pardon?
How likely? Like, you say likely, but...
I'm saying likely because we don't know enough. We need a lot of experimental evidence for the learning and cognitive capacity and affective capacities of these animals. I mean, what is nice about learning is that it brings together the perceptual aspect, the motor aspect, the memory aspect, and the emotional aspects. It brings us together in a system. That is why this is why I think after a year of work, when we are looking at elements, particular elements, when we found this system, we said, well, this system can be a marker. And again, it's a particular type of system. Not any kind of associative learning can do the job. Simple one would not do it.